And welcome to those of you who are both returning and new. If you can believe it, this is our final webinar for the 21-22 season. We'll be taking a break after this until we pick back up likely in September 2022. And I am really excited about today's webinar. For those of you who don't know me, I am Lauren Kilroy-Eubank, the Dean of Content and Strategy at Smart History. And I am delighted to introduce today's speaker, Nancy Demerdash, who is a professor of art history at Albion College, where she teaches broadly about Islamic art and architecture. And she is going to be speaking with us today about the Kaaba. It is obviously a very vibrant, complex monument, site, architecture, textile. There's all sorts of things that we're going to talk about today. And she's going to give us just a few strategies about how we can teach it in our survey classes in all of its kind of vibrant complexity. And just a reminder that if you have questions, it would be really useful just for me when I field them at the end, if you could put them in a Q&A instead of the chat, just for my sake. If you have questions, feel free to put them at any moment in the Q&A and we'll get to them at the end. For now, I'm going to turn the screen over to Nancy.
All right, thank you so much, Lauren, for that generous introduction, and thank you for inviting me here today. I want to thank also the entire broader network of scholars in the Smart History community for democratizing art historical knowledge and rendering it accessible to audiences around the world. I firmly believe in this mission, and I hope you all appreciate the importance of all that you do. All right, I am going to stop my camera just so that there are no glitches. So I'll continue the presentation, but I'll stop my camera. So anyways, before I begin, I want to sort of highlight the photograph that we're looking at here of an installation by the contemporary Saudi Arabian artist, Ahmed Matar, who created this piece from a simple thimble-sized black magnetic cube surrounded by microscopic iron filings radiating around it, evoking the sevenfold circumambulation that millions of Muslims participate in every year, called the Hajj. In recalling a conversation with Matar's grandfathers about the experience of Hajj, they described to him a sensation of being physically pulled into the Kaaba, as if by some spiritual force of immeasurable magnitude. Oh, sorry. Although a recent work of art by a singular artist based in Saudi Arabia, I thought the piece captures this metaphor of magnetism and its subtext of attraction and compulsion that philosophically and ritualistically undergird the Kaaba, both in its deep historical and contemporary resonances. And here in the photograph on the right, you can see Venetia Porter introducing Matar's piece to Prince Charles. From the outset, I'm just going to say that the Kaaba is such a rich building historically and culturally that fully explaining its significance and deep spiritual symbolism for a third of the world's population in the span of 20 minutes is a seemingly impossible task. So instead, what I want to do today is to very briefly but efficiently provide a kind of socio-historical and contextual overview of the building in the historical moment of its transformation into a symbolic locus of Islamic worship and site of pilgrimage. Secondly, I want to discuss the cultural lives and global receptions of the Kaaba through different sorts of objects related to the Hajj, produced in different historical contexts. And finally, I will sort of point audiences and all of you here on the call to some helpful resources that delve into the Kaaba's very complex histories. And I'll provide a bibliography that will later be sort of attached to this talk in a few days' time. Before we deep dive into the site's newfound significance with the spread of Islam and its later reception throughout history, it's useful to get acquainted with the broad geographical and social context of pre-Islamic Arabia. I always try to tell my students that Islam as a religion and a set of beliefs and customs did not emerge out of a historical vacuum. As you can see from the two maps here, Arabia was at the crossroads of multiple empires: the Byzantines in Anatolia to the northwest, the Sasanians in Persia to the northeast, the Ghassanids or Ghassasina in Arabic, an Arab kingdom that kind of became a vassal or client state to the Byzantine Empire, fighting off the Sasanians, the Lakhmids, or Lakhmiyun in Arabic, another Arab kingdom that were clients and allies to the Sasanians, and the Christian kingdom of Aksum in present-day Ethiopia. Needless to say, Arabia was by no means unified during this period, and it's important to know that most communities were formed and clustered according to tribal clan affiliations. You can see that with the exceptions of towns popping up in oases, the greatest number of settlements can be found in the region of the Hijaz, which is a kind of area that hugs the western coast of Arabia along the Red Sea. The cities of Yathrib, or also known as Medina, and Mecca in particular, were major centers of commerce and religion. Different tribal clans, which often practiced different religions, including Judaism, Christianity, and various forms of polytheistic cults, vied for control of territory in which specific trade routes were situated. And so in turn, these clans politically competed for the wealth generated by these trade networks. One cannot overstate the pivotal role that mercantilism played in the Arabian Peninsula, at the literal crossroads connecting to Egypt, Mesopotamia, East Africa, Persia, Anatolia, and South Asia all at once. Multi-directional trade networks shaped not only the political economies through the influx of capital in the region, but they also impacted the spread of heterogeneous myriad ideas, religious belief systems, cultural practices, and artistic conventions. Luxury goods like aromatics, such as frankincense and myrrh, were coming from Aksum, and here we're seeing in the second image from the left an incense burner with an image of a camel rider on it. Rich textiles of wool and silk brocades were passing through Byzantium, and gold and other portable objects like jewelry and statuary passed through the peninsula as well. And cities along these routes provided shelter and levied taxes on caravans transporting these commodities, generating immense wealth for the local communities. Because of this cross-fertilization of influences, the Arabian Peninsula witnessed a vast range of artistic modes of expression, and figural representation had a long-standing presence here. Statues alongside even just stones, actual stones, came to be widely venerated and even worshipped outright. And here we're looking at objects from an exhibition called Roads of Arabia, which traveled widely throughout the world. And I actually saw it at the Louvre, Abu Dhabi. And so here we can see different modes of figural representation. The previous slide showed works of art that were featured in an exhibition at the Met called The World Between Empires, Art and Identity in the Ancient Middle East. So you can sort of look up more information on these objects featured in those exhibitions. But the 9th century commentator named Ibn al-Kalbi notes that a tradition of stone worship was normalized and that people carried actually stone fragments from Mecca with them, replicating the act of circumambulation. Now, I know this quote is rather long, but this is actually one of the earliest extant sources that we have, sort of detailing the kind of afterlife of the Kaaba and the history of the Kaaba. And so it is actually a very widely referenced resource, or sort of primary source. I'll just read a few sentences. He says, the reason that led them, the descendants of Ishmael, to the worship of images and stones was the following. No one left Mecca without carrying with him a stone from the stones of the sacred house, that is the Kaaba, as a token of reverence to it, and as a sign of deep affection to Mecca. Wherever he settled, he would erect the stone and circumambulate it in the same manner he used to circumambulate the Kaaba before his departure from Mecca, seeking thereby its blessing and affirming his deep affection for the holy house. In time, this led them to the worship of whatever took their fancy and caused them to forget their former worship. They exchanged the religion of Abraham and Ishmael for another. Consequently, they took the worship of images, becoming like nations before them. Now, I'll sort of unpack that passage in a little bit. We're going to look at some more, one more passage by Ibn al-Kalbi. So we'll return to that thought. So remember that this kind of tinge of bias that's permeating through this text. Mecca, though, where the Prophet Muhammad was born around 570 CE, was a major node in these networks, as mentioned previously, and was actually a pilgrimage point for worshippers of a deity named Hubal, the deity that the local tribe, the Quraysh, considered to be the greatest, and the sole deity whose statue was placed inside the Kaaba, for whom rituals would be performed. Now, Hubal was not the only deity. There were also sort of some female deities, a sort of triad of females called Mennet, El-Uzza, and Alat, were sort of the famed female deities. In this other passage from Ibn al-Kalbi, we can read about sort of the beliefs of the Quraysh, and I'll just read a few sentences. The Quraysh also had several idols in and around the Kaaba. The greatest of these was Hubal. It was, as I was told, of red agate, in the form of a man with the right hand broken off. It came into the possession of the Quraysh in this condition, and they, therefore, made it a hand of gold. It stood inside the Kaaba. In front of it were 7 divination arrows. On one of these arrows was written pure, and on the other impure. Whenever the lineage of a newborn child was doubted, they would offer a sacrifice to Hubal, and then shuffle the arrows and throw them. If the arrows showed the word pure, the child would be declared legitimate and the tribe would accept him. If, however, the arrows showed the words impure, the child would be declared illegitimate and the tribe would reject him. So we can see how statuary functioned in vis-a-vis these practices of divination in this passage. Sources also state, in addition to this main statue of Hubal, that inside the Kaaba or around the Kaaba, there were horns of a ram, 2 golden gazelles, swords of armor, all of it which were considered the Kaaba's treasure. So that's just something to note as well. But now that we understand sort of this ancient context of the Kaaba and the ways in which it was used by the Quraysh, it becomes necessary to discuss the Prophet Muhammad, who because of him and his followers, he's really the one who's responsible for sort of changing the role and the future narrative of the structure itself. So the Prophet Muhammad was raised by his grandfather and later by his uncle. This sort of family tree that you're seeing here is from a famous text by the Islamic historian Ira Lapidus. So you can look that up in the bibliography later. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was illiterate. He worked the caravans his whole life as a merchant. He did not receive his first revelations, though, as revealed to him by the Archangel Gabriel, until he was about 40 years old. Initially, he told his wife, Khadija, a wealthy widow, and later he told his closest companions of his revelations. But soon thereafter, he shared his whole story, his story and his revelations as revealed to him by God, the Quran, effectively, publicly. So now the Quraysh were quite displeased at Muhammad's following, right? The following that he was gaining in Mecca, as he sort of proclaimed and widely revealed his revelations, right? The Quraysh were displeased not only because it undermined their entire way of life and belief system, but his teachings ultimately threatened Mecca's political economy by potentially doing away with the lucrative business brought by pilgrims visiting Hubal at the Kaaba. So in 622, the Prophet Muhammad and his closest companions had to flee Mecca out of fear of persecution and possible death in an event called the Hijra, and this is an Arabic word for immigration. And they settled in an oasis town to the north known as Medina or Yathrib. There, in his own house, which I'm showing you here on the left, sort of schematic view of it, which became what some scholars believe to be the kind of architectural model upon which all mosques are built, including a courtyard and a roofed prayer hall. The Prophet Muhammad preached his revelations and gained an enormous congregation of followers. And by the year around 629 to 630, the Prophet Muhammad, backed by thousands of supporters, marched back to Mecca and smashed the roughly 300 pieces of statuary in and around the Kaaba. As Simon O'Meara says, though, there's not a neatly uniform narrative in the early Islamic sources as to what exactly happens after the reconquest of Mecca. And it's really hard to know what truly occurred, in part because many of those earliest sources date to the 9th century. And it was exactly during this time in the 9th century when the entire Eastern Mediterranean and large parts of West Asia were embroiled in the debates on iconoclasm, or what is sometimes called the iconoclastic controversies, from 726 to 787, and then later from 815 to 843 CE. So really, when we read sources like Ibn Kelbi, right, it's important for us to sort of be cognizant of the broader discursive environment and conversations around iconoclasm that were happening in the region at this time. In a Shia narrative from the 15th century, Hubal is smashed and thrown down by the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, Ali, seen here. So you can see Ali standing on the Prophet's shoulders, lifting up some of those statues. And the convention of representing blank faces for the Khulafat Rashidun, or the Rashidun caliphs, and the Prophet Muhammad is quite common. So Christian Gruber has written a magnum opus on kind of the representation of the Prophet Muhammad throughout Islamic art history, if you're interested in that sort of thing. In an Ottoman illuminated folio based on a 14th century narrative, Ali is shown outside of the Kaaba, slamming a statue to the ground that is labeled in the painting as Hubal. But what exactly does the Kaaba signify for Muslims, and how did the rite of Hajj actually come about? Well, the Hijra and that eventual return of the Prophet to Mecca after his escape and exile from it symbolizes for Muslims the transition from a pagan, idolatrous existence, that which most Muslims refer to as Jahiliyyah, or sort of this era of ignorance. Jahl in Arabic means ignorance, which is defined by a society based on tribal kinship to one that is based on common belief. Right. While this may seem like a problematic binary or dichotomy to some, the stark contrast and shift from an ontological state of ignorance to one of enlightenment is rather widely accepted. The Kaaba itself, stemming from the Arabic word for cube, represents the epicenter of the Islamic world, or the Ummah, which denotes the unified global community of faithful Muslims. Muslims believe that originally Abraham, who is a prophet for Muslims, mentioned in the Quran, also called the first Muslim in the Quran, and someone called a Hanif, who in Arabic is someone who is opposed to idolatry. Abraham erected the Kaaba for God as a sacred house on a site that was already hallowed by Adam. At the northeastern facade wall of the Kaaba, there's also a small domed building called the Station of Abraham, or the Maqam Ibrahim. The inside is clad, the inside of the Kaaba, that is clad with marble floor and revetment, and 3 wooden pillars support the roof, while the outside is covered with a black brocade cloth embroidered in gold with Quranic texts called the Kiswa, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. And the bottom edge of the Kiswa can be raised or lowered by cords. The structure stands in the midst of an open court enclosed by porticos and arcaded galleries. And this is the Haram, the sanctuary. Every lunar year, that is every Islamic calendar lunar year, on the 7th to the 13th day of Dhul al-Hijjah, the 12th month of that calendar year, Muslim pilgrims perform the ritual of Hajj, which replicates the first time the Prophet and his followers observed the Hajj in 629 CE. It is a sacred rite, and all able-bodied Muslims who can afford it must perform it at least once in their lifetime, and circumambulate in a counterclockwise fashion the Kaaba 7 times, and take part of rituals, including listed here, the kissing of the black stone, which I've shown you images here in the lower left-hand corner. These are taken from Dr. Elizabeth Macaulay Lewis's Smart History article on the Kaaba, so you can look at those more closely in her text. They kiss the corner of the Kaaba on this black stone, which is thought to be actually the only original stone from the original structure. This is what is believed to be the case. B, running back and forth between the hills of As-Safa and El-Marwa, drinking the water from the nearby spring of Zemzem, standing on the plains of Mount Arafat, 12 miles east of the city, throwing stones to symbolically stone or cast away the devil, shaving one's head in an act of purification, and lastly, sacrificing an animal to commemorate Prophet Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his own son during the culminating festival of the Eid al-Adha. The ritual is intended to directly reference the Prophet Abraham. But of course, the Kaaba is sort of the focal point of all of this. The Kaaba serves as a visual and symbolic anchor too in the daily lives of Muslims. Among the 5 obligatory pillars that all Muslims perform, the Kaaba features directly and indirectly with 3 of them: the Shahada, or the profession of faith, there is no God but Allah, and I witness that Muhammad is his prophet, attests to the fact that the Quraysh are being forced to repudiate and expunge the existence of all gods except Allah. Another requirement, salat or prayer, mandates that Muslims pray 5 times a day towards the Qibla, or the direction towards the Kaaba in Mecca. And finally, the last obligatory custom of the Hajj or pilgrimage, which Muslims see as an ultimate act of devotion and personal piety. How is the Kaaba remembered and imagined by Muslims through Islamic visual and material culture? A few years ago at the British Museum, and in sort of collaboration with the Nasruddin Khalili collection of Hajj and Arts of the Pilgrimage, the British Museum put on this exhibition on objects from the Hajj. So a lot of the objects that I'm going to be showing you here actually hail from that exhibition. And one such object that used to be ritually created from year to year in Egypt since the Fatimid era around the year 1000 is that of the kiswa. That is the sacred cloth that covers the entire structure of the Kaaba. And fragments of this you can see here on the left. You can see sort of bands of in a zigzagging pattern with calligraphic text that read the Shahada, or the Testament of Faith. Since the 1970s, though, it's important to note that the kiswa has been woven in a special workshop directly in Mecca. On the right, I'm showing you a fragment of a curtain from the minbar, or pulpit, of the holy sanctuary of Mecca, commissioned by King Farouk of Egypt, another example of sort of high quality embroidery. Ottoman tiles representing a flattened Kaaba at the epicenter, such as this one belonging to Etmekçizade Mehmet Pasha, were popular during the early modern period. A similar tile can be seen in the mosque of the vizier Rustem Pasha in Istanbul. In another Ottoman tile seen here on the left, the bird's eye view over Mecca is inspired by European pictorial and cartographic traditions. Schematic flattened renderings of the Kaaba featured in the lush, gilt illuminated manuscripts of a text that widely circulated through the Muslim world, called the Dalail al-Khairat, by a 15th century Moroccan Sufi named al-Jazuli. The text is a spiritual guidebook of sorts, containing snippets of hadith, or epithets and sayings of the Prophet, the 201 names of the Prophet Muhammad and their spiritual nuances and meaning, descriptions of the tombs of the Prophet Abu Bakr and Omar in Medina, and prayers for specific days of the week. So it's sort of a spiritual guidebook. Vistas of the Kaaba were captured in modern miniature paintings, such as this one by the artist dubbed the Delhi cartographer, named Muhammad Abdullah, whose grandfather, Mazhar Ali Khan, was a court painter to the Mughal ruler of Bahadur Shah II. The panorama is the earliest known depiction of the Masjid al-Haram and its immediate vicinity. And here we have another miniature, this one produced on ivory by we think this is also done by Muhammad Abdullah as well. Muhammad Sadiq Bey, an Egyptian army engineer and land surveyor, was one of the first photographers in the mid-19th century to capture scenes of Mecca and Medina using glass plate negatives. His photographs of the two sanctuaries, as well as at sites like Mount Arafat and Mina, were taken in 1861, 1880, and 1881. And so for the first time, the act of pilgrimage within the holy sites were recorded and documented and could be realistically imagined by believers. Before the Ottoman-built Hejaz Railway, which connected Ottoman territories directly to the Hejaz, people went to Mecca via caravan. And here we can see an Italian-born photographer, Dumas, picturing pilgrims departing Damascus. He had studios in both Beirut and Istanbul. And finally, professional studio photography came to be used almost as a form of tourist memorabilia too, in capturing for pilgrims their experience. Here we see a married couple performing or about to perform Hajj, dressed in ihram. This describes a state of ritual purification that pilgrims must reach before entering the sacred territory of Mecca. The state of ihram is valid when the pilgrim is clean of mind and body and is wearing the ritual clothing. Men have to wear certain lengths of unstitched cotton cloth, and women may wear more or less any form of modest clothing. Although, of course, there are certain rules to abide by. Hopefully by now you can see how the structure has undergone multiple changes and iterations in its physical form, symbolism, and meaning. But all in all, I hope you can see how this holy site is, for Muslims, emblematic of a covenant with God and whose blessing is sought during the performance of that most sacred of rituals, Hajj. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That was great. I learned a lot.
That's great. I'm so happy to hear that.
No, it was excellent. And if people have questions, please begin posting them in the Q&A. I have a couple questions that have come in via other channels, but I just want to start by saying I thought it was really it was a good refresher for me, but also like I said, I learned a lot, and I loved the way that you gave us that history, that deeper history of Arabia, and even couching the discussions of those primary sources around the debates and iconoclasm, which I think is just a really important reminder to be thinking broadly about, all of these peoples and places being in this larger networks and conversations. And I think that was really useful for me. I won't speak for anyone else.
100%. Yeah, no, I mean, I'll let you sort of ask whatever questions people have.
Well, I mean, I have a lot, but I'm going to leave it to everyone else's. But so the first question that has come in is could you expand a bit on the tradition that the Kaaba is, land hallowed by Adam and perhaps Abraham, which you mentioned earlier, like, could you elaborate a bit more on that idea?
Oh, sure. Well, again, this is sort of what is believed and believed by Muslims, but also I think it is recounted in the surah of that surah, meaning the verse of Al-Baqarah, which is the verse of the cow in the Quran. I think it describes, and again, I'm not a theologian, so my kind of knowledge of Quranic exegesis is somewhat limited, so I'm not going to claim that I have the specifics, but the descriptions of its relevance vis-a-vis Abraham and vis-a-vis Adam, I believe, and I could be mistaken, but I am somewhat certain that they are rooted in the text of the Quran itself, which Muslims believe to be the literal word of God. So it is a kind of uncontested belief in the faith that that Adam had a presence on site, and so did his sort of future successor, Abraham.
Thank you. Another question that has come in is, can you speak to the transformations of the actual, architectural structure over time?
Yeah, so that's an excellent point. And I actually kind of glossed over that because I felt that in the span of 20 minutes, I couldn't get to the changes of the structure. The structure had been destroyed in a fight sort of during the Umayyad period. I think it had even burned partially to the ground. As I mentioned, fragments of that black stone that is so deeply revered and kissed and touched and so forth during the actual circumambulations. That's the only fragment that's sort of thought to have remained from the original structure. But again, we don't have any concrete archaeological evidence to prove that. It underwent many transformations during the Abbasid period, during the Ottoman period, under Suleiman the Magnificent. For one, I know he was responsible for some major transformations to the site. And then, of course, in more modern recent history, obviously, the Ottomans had a vested interest in the 19th century in constructing the Ottoman Railway, the Hejaz Railway network. And actually, my colleague, Peter Christensen, has written a magnificent book on that subject. He teaches at Rochester. But in any case, it is an understatement to say that it is a palimpsestic monument, that it has undergone just layers and layers of augmentation and erasure, and ultimately it has been a site of contestation, right? Because the Islamic Ummah, that I think people tend to forget, that the Muslim world was always divided, right? You had Umayyads in Spain, but you also had, the Abbasids in Iraq. So, you had various factions, right, that had different sorts of attachments to these holy sites, and also different sorts of physical control over these holy sites too. So I think there are a number of scholars who have written wonderful things. Simon O'Meara wrote a recent book that was published by Edinburgh University Press, which is amazing, in 2020, on kind of the longue durée history of the Kaaba, and some of those transformations are detailed in that text too. So hopefully that answers that.
Yeah, and I think that actually relates really wonderfully to a question that came in just as you were mentioning it, in fact, which is, are beliefs surrounding the Kaaba unified, or are there distinctions, even subtle distinctions of beliefs among different groups, whether that's historically or, even in the present?
Yeah. I cannot speak to the kind of theological minutia, but I am certain that there are distinctions. I would assume, or I would presume, that that for sure the Shia and the Sunnah, the Sunnis, right, have different probably interpretations of the site itself. But that said, I think that it's important to see that there is both there is both coherence and kind of dissonance in the attitudes and ways in which audiences have kind of perceived the site over the years. Again, I think it would take someone who's sort of more deeply entrenched in theological debates, and perhaps a scholar of divinity who would be able to kind of speak to those subtleties. But for sure, I'm certain there are distinctions, and those distinctions also sometimes are parsed out in the hadith, right? The sayings and kind of the sunnah, the epithets of the prophet, and so forth. So yes.
It's complicated.
It's complicated, very much so.
Well, I just want to thank you again for a wonderful presentation. I mean, I think the next time I teach this, I will really have to rethink some of the ways that I teach it, just to, I think, I really appreciated even that you talked about pilgrimage souvenirs and all these things. And I thought that was really wonderful and much appreciated. So thank you for joining us and walking us through some of the ways that you approach this. And thank you everyone for coming. Just to be sensitive to Nancy's time and everyone else's time, I think we'll wrap up here. And what a wonderful way to cap off our webinar series for this academic year. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all on the call, and I wish you the best. Thank you.
Yeah. And for now, everyone, we'll reconvene in September. So for now, goodbye.